breathtaking tower in the forests of Croatia.
If this was in any town or city in the world, it would make for an extraordinary landmark.
A groundbreaking complex in New York City.
It's quite a mystery what this is. It has this big hangar-like feel, something like I've never seen before.
A Colombian ghost town reclaimed by nature.
They've almost been sucked down into the earth beneath them. It's quite an eerie place.
And a majestic facility on the banks of the River Thames.
As you enter, you can really feel the grandiosity of this place. It's almost cathedral-like.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the edge of New York Harbor is a colossal, modern-looking building.
This one you can't miss. Even from miles away, you can see this structure is absolutely enormous.
You actually come to realize that there are two buildings that are linked by these huge hovering bridges.
Only when entering inside does its abandoned state become clear. Its purpose, however, is anything but.
In the center of the building is this giant atrium that goes up for several stories, and there's railroad tracks that run right through it.
But then it has these strange protuberances, these balconies jutting out of the walls. Something like I've never seen before.
This building was a response to an unparalleled logistical challenge.
There's probably few buildings in the world that saw so many people come in and out of its doors. And unfortunately, many of those who passed through the doors of this place never came back alive.
In 1917, the United States entered the First World War. But fighting on battlefields thousands of miles away posed an unprecedented problem.
The U.S. had a huge logistical challenge of getting tens of thousands of troops and thousands of tons of equipment, food, and supplies back and forth across the Atlantic.
An army of 2 million needed to be raised and shipped across the ocean. To achieve this mammoth task, they designed this extraordinary complex.
In so many areas, this building is a record breaker, and the reason for that is its incredibly innovative design.
This is the Brooklyn Army Terminal, and the man behind its creation was the renowned architect Cass Gilbert.
Now, Cass Gilbert is really well known for designing buildings like the neo-Gothic skyscraper, the Woolworth building. This is obviously a very different building, very utilitarian.
Andrew Gustafsson is an expert on the history of the structure.
This building was built entirely out of reinforced concrete. And when it was built, it was the largest concrete building in the world. You can see it was built with floors, almost 10 inches thick.
The concrete structure was so robust, it was rated to handle 250 pounds per square foot. They actually allowed the workers to drive around in military jeeps. And you can still see some of the speed limit signs today.
This was a vast logistical hub that would carry urgently needed troops, weapons, and supplies to the trenches of Western Europe. And at its heart was the atrium.
This was designed to be the main cargo handling area for the facility. This was an indoor rail yard. You could drive 2 trains directly into the building, and overhead, we used to have glass, so it could operate 24/7 year-round, regardless of the weather. These trains would pull in, and they would unload them onto this central platform. And then above us, we also have a pair of old 5-ton electric gantry cranes. So these cranes could be positioned over that cargo. They would lower a cable, pick it up, and then they would drop it into these balconies.
It was really a marvel. It had 96 centrally controlled freight elevators, giving it just amazing logistical potential. And it was the most advanced freight terminal in the world at the time.
The cargo wasn't just here to be stored. It needed to be moved in and out at a moment's notice. For this, Cass Gilbert designed something unique.
So we're standing in the Sky Bridge. Essentially, they built a whole separate grade on the 3rd level that connected Warehouse A out to the piers. The idea was that once you loaded a piece of cargo into the warehouse, it never touched the ground again until it was loaded onto a ship.
It meant that the Army terminal had the capability to do intermodal shipping. There's no sort of barrier in between where things have to be offloaded, carried to the pier, and then loaded again. They come straight from the train and onto the ship, vastly speeding up the process of supplying armies or transporting troops.
It was a groundbreaking site, built in record time.
This massive 4 million square foot facility of piers and wharves and warehouses and terminals was constructed over just 17 months. 4 million square feet in 17 months.
And yet, it wasn't quick enough. The summer offensives of 1918, led by Britain and France, had brought Germany to its knees. By the autumn, Allied victory was all but complete, with 10,000 American troops arriving in France every day. But not one of them came through this complex.
The United States joined the war in April of 1917, but didn't get its first troops into battle until June of 1918. So we were planning on a 1919 campaign, but the war ends in 1918, so what do you do with this place?
Completed in September 1919, they had missed the war by 10 months. But it wasn't long before the government found a new enemy of the state, this time internally, and it would give the terminal a new lease of life.
Prohibition starts in early 1920, and all of a sudden the federal government is mobilizing tons of resources to fight the scourge of alcohol.
They confiscated an awful lot of liquor in the city of New York. A lot of it was stored here.
And at any given time during Prohibition, there was something like $250 million in today's dollars worth of confiscated drugs and alcohol in these big buildings.
In fact, at one point they had so much they started to dispose of it through a hole in the dock.
One New Yorker had a cunning plan to exploit this situation.
Now, one day in 1927, when they opened up that hole in the pier, they discovered strings of about 20 buckets that were hanging on wires underneath that hole. So someone had actually rowed underneath the pier, strung up those buckets, waited for them to dump out that slurry of beer and wine. I don't know what they would advertise it as, but probably some pretty unpleasant stuff.
The terminal proved a useful tool in the fight against alcohol, but its original wartime design was about to be put to the test.
Most Americans had regarded World War I as the war to end all wars. But then, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, sink most of the American Pacific Fleet. America suddenly finds itself in a world war again.
With World War II, you really have the Brooklyn Army Terminal coming sort of full circle, so to speak, to fulfill its original purpose.
The first two major deployments of the U.S. Army following the attack on Pearl Harbor both started right here. On January 15th, 1942, Operation Magnet began. And so this was a deployment of about 4,000 U.S. Army troops going from Brooklyn to Belfast, Northern Ireland, to help reinforce the British there. Just about a week after Operation Magnet, we had another task force that was assembled that was bringing the first American troops into the Pacific Theater.
Over the course of the war, 3.2 million military personnel moved through this building and 37 million tons of equipment.
the Brooklyn Army Terminal became the largest supply base anywhere in the world during World War II.
The terminal also holds another sobering record.
It was the solemn duty and responsibility of the Brooklyn Army Terminal to actually receive the remains of Americans killed in the European theater. In fact, 140,000 Americans came back to the Brooklyn Army Terminal. That represents about 3/4 of all of the Americans whose remains were repatriated to the United States.
Although the Second World War came to an end in 1945, the terminal's work didn't stop there.
This really became, the major military port on the East Coast. But also there was this, routine rotation of troops coming in and out of Europe during the Cold War.
And one of the more famous soldiers to depart from the terminal was Elvis Presley.
He's drafted into the military. And what he decides to do is, rather than serve in special services, which would have enabled him to perform as a musician and entertain troops, he actually decides to enlist as a regular soldier. So he goes through basic training, and in September of 1958, he decides to hold this massive press scene at Brooklyn Army Terminal before he departs.
This is a huge PR and marketing moment for the U.S. Army, that this massive rock star was putting his career on pause to serve his country.
Despite its once revolutionary design, the terminal's days were numbered. In 1966, it was forced out of business, outdated by the advent of containerized shipping. Yet its strength and design has ensured that the Brooklyn Army Terminal still has a future.
It's a sign of how well-made and functional this building is, that even though much of it has sat empty for decades, parts of it are now being reused, and new businesses are moving in, restaurants, startup companies. So some corners of this complex are actually thriving with new life.
In rural Colombia, in the shadow of the Andes Mountains, a site lies shattered and semi-hidden in the undergrowth.
You've got sort of roads that sometimes appear to lead nowhere or just disappear. And then you've got buildings either side that seem to have almost been engulfed by the ground.
Everything is really odd. You don't know if the ground has risen up or if the buildings have sunk down.
I mean, when you look in a bit more detail, it's clearly not just one or two buildings. There's whole streets of buildings that seem to be half missing, partly destroyed.
The roofs have been removed off many, and the walls are caving in. This isn't just the ravages of time that's done this.
Whatever happened here didn't just destroy the buildings.
There are crosses, gravestones, and shrines everywhere. People must have died here, and by the sheer number of shrines, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands.
Colombia has a really tumultuous and dangerous history. Was this war? Was this violence? Or was this something else?
And this is one of the worst disasters of this kind in human history. It's certainly up there as one of the most dramatic.
This is the town of Armero. When Freddy Gutierrez lived here, it was a thriving community.
Aquí en este lugar tenemos a la derecha lo que era la Iglesia del Carmen y aquí a la izquierda el Estadio Municipal, Jorge Hayet Durán. Allí en la otra esquina estaba un parque infantil bastante grande. Siempre recuerdo el trasegar, los jugadores.
At its height, this town was home to around 30,000 residents. Freddy lived here with his parents and two brothers.
Esta es la casa, identificada con la nomenclatura Carrera 21. Felizmente vivíamos en esa casa. Hasta aquí estuvimos hasta el 13 de noviembre. De aquí salimos esa noche.
Overnight, this town was transformed from a place of life and vitality into a wasteland. And the reason lay 45 miles to the west.
We are in the plateaus of Nevada del Ruiz, which completely dominates the landscape.
Although the volcano had been silent for decades, in 1984, all that started to change. There were signs that it was starting to come back to life.
The first sign was tremors, and then the following March, a UN seismologist actually observed a 500-foot vapor column and determined that this was a precursor to a massive eruption.
By October 1985, a fairly detailed hazard map had been put together, and it was clear that they'd outlined a number of places that should or needed to be evacuated.
At the center of that map lay Armero, and the damage would likely be catastrophic due to the unique features of this volcano.
It's some 17,400 plus feet high, and even though it's near the equator, because of its height, its upper part and its peak is covered in snow and ice. If you impart hot volcanic material onto snow and ice, you very quickly turn it into water, and you can mix that loose volcanic material into almost like what we'd call a volcanic slurry. And this phenomenon, called a lahar, can be quite deadly.
The hazard map placed Armero directly in the firing line of these lahars. But what the geologists predicted and what the residents were told were two very different things.
The map met with criticism from the authorities because they felt that it was too alarming, and so they decided not to widely distribute it amongst the population.
Armero's residents were completely unprepared for what was coming their way.
The possibility of lahars was high, and geologists predicted that any magma coming through the summit could have devastating effects. They desperately urged local officials to evacuate, but it seems that their warnings fell on deaf ears.
6 weeks after the hazard map had been produced and the evacuation of Armero first recommended, disaster struck.
On November 13, 1985, black ash began to spew out of the volcano, and immediately geologists demanded the evacuation of Armero and the neighboring villages.
Despite this, Radio Armero called for residents not to panic and stay in their homes. A message echoed by the town's priest over the church's loudspeakers. Just after 9 p.m., the volcano blew. With a massive storm raging and lashing rain outside, few heard the warning signs.
As predicted, the eruption produced pyroclastic flows that melted the summit glaciers and snow, creating 4 thick lahars. But these were far worse than anyone could have ever imagined.
Bueno, cuando la avalancha golpea el pueblo, diría yo que el primer síntoma o la primera experiencia de saber que la avalancha ya vino es el ruido catastrófico, el ruido que se escucha, ¿sí? Es un ruido a veces indescriptible.
Freddie's parents didn't hang around. They grabbed their 3 children, fled the house, and headed down the street, ash falling in the darkness.
Y estábamos todos asustados porque es saber que viene algo a hacernos daño, pero no sabíamos para dónde más, no sabemos qué hacer.
Lahars cascaded into the west side of town, but Freddie was a mile from the initial impact, and they pushed north towards the church.
Desafortunadamente, ahí en la iglesia, íbamos llegando a la iglesia cuando escuchamos que la avalancha también bajaba por la parte del estadio, y todos agarrados de los árboles del frente, y bajó un poquito el nivel. Pero vino una segunda avalancha y volvió y subió el nivel, y fue cuando quedamos todos con el lodo al cuello.
Within minutes, 85% of the town was covered in mud and debris. The sheer volume and speed of the mudflows was astounding.
Mi hermano menor se le sale de las manos a mi madre y vuelve y lo rescata y ya sale prácticamente desnudo. Al sacarlo, no sé, la ropa se le salió. Él tenía 3 años cumplidos.
Many were swept away or pulled under and suffocated by the thick mud of the lahars.
No iba subiendo de nivel, un lodo espeso. Entonces nos agarramos de unos árboles que habían aquí afuera, todos agarrados, el grupo que íbamos, todos agarrados.
Soon, they heard a familiar voice, It was a local man taking refuge on a nearby roof, and he helped them climb the trees to safety.
Fue la noche más trágica y hemos pedido a Dios por nuestras vidas y por la vida de todos y la de nuestro pueblo que estaba en ese momento desapareciendo.
Huddled together, they prepared to see out the night. No idea what scene awaited them in the morning.
El terror, la zozobra, si venían más avalanchas, si se venía más, un silencio profundo se escucha, primero que todo, más luego existen los llantos, los gritos de las personas atrapadas, pero el no saber qué hay abajo o que también nos podíamos hundir.
Freddie and his family survived the night on the rooftop as everything around them was consumed by mud. They were rescued the next day, but after a disastrous relief operation, around 23,000 people are believed to have died. Many of their bodies were never found. It had been the deadliest lahar in recorded history.
It erupted some 35 million tons of material, but that's only about 3 to 4% of what came out of the famous Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. So in many ways, it was a relatively small explosive volcanic event. But if you couple that with the hot material landing on snow and ice, when you then funnel that power down the river valleys, you can turn something that's a relatively small eruption into a deadly lahar.
The town's buildings, most destroyed or buried, some still visible but half sunken, a testament to its power. It serves as a warning that ignoring the advice of scientists is a dangerous game.
This is a really devastating story, and it should be a stark reminder to us in the present day that we should not gamble with people's lives.
The only small positive to come out of this was that after the disaster, the government did create an office to promote awareness of natural disasters.
The remains of Armero are preserved as a memorial to those who died on that fateful night. And for the survivors, the events of the 13th of November 1985 are always with them.
La pena siempre se mantiene, el duelo por nuestra ciudad, por todas las personas que murieron y por todo lo que se perdió. Sin embargo, hay que ubicándonos, tenemos que irnos ubicando en este mundo y hay que seguir adelante.
12 miles east of central London, on the banks of the River Thames, is a diamond in the rough.
This location is far from appealing, and I speak as a fan of the City of London. This site is not easy on the eye.
But inside is a building very much at odds with its setting.
You have this magnificent arched doorway, but you'd never imagine what lays beyond that doorway. It's a complete contrast to the really industrial nature of the surrounding area.
The first time you walk into this building, it's like walking into one of the great cathedrals.
It really does have a feeling of grandiosity about it. All those ornate ironwork interiors with vivid, bright colors.
Some of the machinery in this place is huge, and you can tell that this place was of some significance at its time.
The site played a vital role in the growth of what was the largest city in the world.
This wasn't just a well-designed complex. It also housed a public health solution.
This is really one of the most magnificent feats of Victorian engineering, and yet most people, even though it's right under their feet, have never seen it and know that much about it.
One day in 1989, I got a strange phone call. It turned out from a small group of retired engineers. And they said, we're trying to restore one of your great-great-grandfather's places. Come and have a look.
Peter Bazalgette arrived at a decrepit facility left abandoned for decades.
When I first came into this mysterious place, it hadn't been properly used since the Second World War. It was rusting away, full of dead pigeons. I was overawed by the grandeur of it, but sadly, it was a decaying grandeur.
Neglected in this industrial wasteland, Peter joined forces with a team of retired engineers and set about saving this forgotten piece of heritage.
When I was a kid in the 1950s and 60s, I knew I had a very famous relative from the Victorian age. Nobody else did. We didn't value what the Victorians had done for us. That's very different today.
Designed by his great-great-grandfather, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, and still boasting the biggest rotative beam engines in the world, it was the product of a health crisis in mid-19th century London.
In London's poor East Side, construction and sanitation were completely unregulated, and London became known as a city of two halves, with the wealthy being able to afford to escape to the cleaner air of West London. In the poor half, you had a dense population, crammed together in tiny houses with rats and sewage running between them down the narrow cobbled streets.
You didn't have clean running water. You had houses that were infested with vermin and people living just cheek to jowl, crowded with one another in very, very unhealthy conditions. These were the Victorian slums.
But soon enough, even those in the West couldn't escape the smell of human excrement.
The long, hot summer of 1858 caused a horrendous stench to emanate from London's mighty river.
It was known as the Great Stink.
The smell began wafting into buildings everywhere, including the Houses of Parliament. And because they still believed in the miasma theory, that disease was spread by air or bad smells, they all thought their own health was at serious risk.
Cholera had been ravaging London's population for decades. Sewage pumped directly into the river was spreading the disease, but through the water supply, not through the air, as they believed.
Cholera is a highly infectious disease that is spread through water that has been contaminated by fecal matter.
Physician John Snow had made the connection years earlier and understood that this was a waterborne disease. But even by 1858, few accepted his findings.
These politicians literally believed that they were inhaling diseases. So that was really the last straw to get them to act and to commission Bazalgette to begin his project.
Bazalgette's task was to clean up the city and prevent the spread of disease.
Joseph Bazalgette was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, and his first job in this relatively new organization was to fix London's sewage problem.
And his plan was to run main sewers from the west of the city to the east. And those sewers would run parallel to the Thames, but keep the sewage out of the Thames.
The whole system consisted of 1,300 miles and 82 miles of west-east intercepting sewers.
For 7 years, Joseph Bazalgette dug up the whole of London. He had to cross railway lines, he had to cross canals, he had to redesign the centre of London, he had to build an embankment on the River Thames to take one of the main sewers. I imagine everybody in those days was cursing Joseph Bazalgette for disrupting London, but not after 1865, when it was all finished and London was cleansed. Because his sewage system was a trailblazing, it was an innovation. It showed how a modern city could work.
But how did this building fit into that revolutionary system?
The network of sewers carried the city's wastewater to two vast pumping and filtration systems either side of the Thames, just east of the metropolitan conurbation.
One of those was the pumping station here at Crossness.
Well, this flywheel belongs to a rotative steam beam engine. In fact, there are 4 in this building, the 4 largest ever built ever in the world, and they're named after the members of the British royal family: Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, Alexandra, one of their daughters, and Bertie, one of their sons.
The 4 massive engines at Crossness pumped sewage into a reservoir that held 25 million gallons. The sewage was then released with the ebb tide, so it flowed safely out to sea.
The opening ceremony in 1865 was held here with great pomp.
The pumping station became known as the Cathedral of Sewage, and in a fashion typical of ceremonies in the capital of Imperial Britain, it was opened with a grand ceremony, possibly the most lavish meal ever served inside a sewage facility.
Just look at this. Some of the finest Victorian wrought ironwork ever commissioned. And it shows one thing about the Victorians, immensely proud of public works. This was a building essentially for pumping excrement, London's ordure. But they were so proud of the public effort of cleansing London that they did this to show what a great enterprise it was.
For 80 years, the beam engines at Crossness turned. But after the Second World War, more advanced engines left them redundant. But thanks to a group of enthusiasts, Crossness found a new lease of life.
With all of the colors and intricate metal design, it's clear that a lot of work went into this restoration project.
The trust decided to intervene and restore part of the building and also to restore one of the engines. And now it can be seen operating in all its former glory.
30 years after I first walked in here, and thanks to the extraordinary efforts of the members of the Crossness Engines Trust, determined to preserve this place and celebrate it, we now have a living museum, a living steam museum. And if you look at this magnificent beam arm of this restored engine, look at the way it's painted, look at the majesty of it, you can tell that today we really appreciate what the Victorians did and how they really created modern society that we still rely on today.
While this pumping station has been restored, parts of Bazalgette's system never went out of use.
So they're building a new super sewer, not to replace, but to complement Joseph's system.
That the intercepting sewers are still in use 150 years later, it's really a testament to the overall build quality of the system as it was originally constructed.
"60 miles south of Zagreb, in the wooded hills of Petrova Gora, a dazzling building sits high on a mountain peak.
The building almost swallows you whole. It's simply otherworldly.
It looks modern. It makes you think of something that would be in a city, but this is in the mountains, in the middle of nowhere.
As you venture in, you realize it is just as modern and abstract inside.
This is something that you merge into as you would come into a house of worship.
Although there aren't any windows, it's surprisingly light inside. The offset slices allow streams of light to flood in from above.
It's not some abandoned industrial works, but it's on an industrial scale almost. It's just this really perplexing building that looks out of place.
These vast concrete curves covered in stainless steel, spiraling up 120 feet into the sky, make for an extraordinary landmark.
Somebody is trying to make a point with this structure.
But what was its purpose? And why has such a striking landmark seemingly been left to ruin? Chedomir Student is a local historian and the custodian of this remarkable complex.
Kao što se vidi prema konfiguraciji prostorija da je ovo jedan vrlo futuristički za ono vreme i ambiciozan projekat. Znači, od svih nivoa, cirka nekih 11, na donjem nivou, znači pod zemljom, se nalazi koncertna ili kongresna dvorana sa oko 1000 mjesta. Znači, sljedeće etaže su vam, znači, edukacijska funkcija, multimedijalna, kongresna, znači, spomenik kao svoju zamisao je imao futuristički smisao.
The reason for its existence can be unearthed from the woods it overlooks.
This huge, towering building dominates the hillside, but it's not the only structure here. When you start exploring, you come across some more abandoned buildings, very deep in the woods.
These buildings are scattered about, and when you go inside, it's clear that people once lived here.
Those that filled these empty cabins were engaged in a desperate fight for survival, part of an ethnic conflict that dates back to the interwar period.
Between the First and Second World Wars, there was constant fighting amongst the various ethnic groups that comprised Yugoslavia.
At the forefront of the power struggle were the right-wing fascist group, the Ustasha.
The Croatian Ustasha believed that Croats were ethnically superior to especially Serbs.
Many Croat nationalists supported the Ustasha because they believed that this was a ticket to independence from Serbia.
When the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, the Ustasha were their natural allies.
The Nazis were very happy to contribute to the disintegration of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and to take the Croatian part and turn it into a puppet state that was ruled by the Ustasha. The Nazis didn't have to go and repress anyone in Croatia because the Ustasha did it for them. For a brief moment, the Croatians had their own state away from Yugoslavia, but it wasn't so much a Croatian state as it was a terrorist state of this brutal militia.
But their dominance was about to be challenged. Hidden in the thick forests of Petrova Gora, a number of settlements were being built.
Sada dolazimo na jedan izuzetno važan I bitan lokalitet vezan za oslobodilački pokret I vezan za Drugi svjetski rat.
Those behind it were the Cordon Partisan Detachment, part of the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia. And at the helm was one of history's most notorious leaders.
The Cordon Partisan Detachment wasn't just led by anyone. It was led by a figure who would become a major player in 20th century politics, Josip Broz, who was also known as Tito. He's a communist and envisions a Yugoslavia that is going to share that political ideology.
To overthrow the Ustasha, Tito needed an army and secure bases to operate from.
They needed to have headquarters, they needed to have hospitals to look after their wounded, they needed places to collect weapons, and the wooded hills of Petrova Gora, the St. Peter Mountains, were an ideal place for this.
Nalazimo se u kompleksu centralne partizanske bolnice na lokaciji Pišin Gaj. Svoju namjenu, znači tu je operacijna sala, tu su bolnička odjeljenja, tu je zubna ambulanta, tu je kuhinja, gore je stražarnica. Objekti koji su u stvari obezbeđivali kompletnu infrastrukturu.
Using guerrilla tactics, they ambushed the Ustasha from their bases deep in the woods, while recruiting more Serbs to join their cause.
Na ovom teritoriju Petrove Gore djelovalo je 15 partizanskih odreda. Kordunaški partizanski odredi su bilo velikom većinom sastavljeni od seljačkog stanovništva sa ovog područja.
For the partisans to survive, it was essential that their stronghold remain hidden.
Sredstvima. Evo primjer jedan je između ostalog poljski WC koji je tako napravljen da izgleda kao WC, ali se u vrlo brzom momentu može demontirati, otvoriti sve ovo i ući u unutrašnjost i skloniti ranjenike.
This 30-building strong hospital masked a network of underground bunkers capable of sheltering hundreds of soldiers. It wasn't long, though, before the Ustasha had the stronghold of Petrova Gora firmly in their sights.
In early April 1942, there was a sudden breakthrough of defences. Ustasha forces stormed multiple partisan positions around Petrova Gora.
Given that these ethnic Serbs only had crude weapons and pitchforks, given that they were going against armed soldiers, they really stood no chance.
Svirepa osveta ustaškog režima nad narodom ovog kraja rezultirala je da je svaki treći stanovnik Korduna, od koga su 98% bili Srbi, da je ubijen u tom ratu.
The Ustasha continued their vicious attempts to cleanse the region of Serbs. Yet this hospital was never discovered, and the tide of war soon turned in Tito's favor.
The partisans may have lost this fight, but over the course of the war, they did gain ground. Backed by their communist allies around the world, and later the British and their allies, by the end of the war, when the Germans retreated, much of the area was under Tito's control.
Tito's prestige as the man who led the opposition to the Nazis and to the Ustasha made him a national hero across what was Yugoslavia.
Under Tito's firm grip, Yugoslavia was brought back together, and for many years there was relative peace between the ethnic groups. This structure was built as a symbolic phoenix rising from the ashes of war.
Titova uloga u donošenju odluke da se ovdje napravi spomenik je baš bila vezana za to da se oduži ovom stanovništvu za njegove žrtve u prošlom ratu.
The stainless steel panels are hugely reflective, and this effect symbolizes light overcoming darkness. Within the structure was originally a museum which housed hundreds of documents, relics, and artifacts related to the battle and the history of the ethnic Serbian struggles in the region.
But just before it opened in 1981, Tito died, and with him the peace he had brought. Ethnic divisions resurfaced, and in 1991, war again erupted.
With the onset of the Yugoslav wars, the monument falls into disrepair, it's looted, it is defaced, so it has a really sad ending.
Today, Yugoslavia is a distant memory, but the monument that still stands here tells a story that must never be forgotten.
Osobiti značaj ovog prostora u dušama i srcima naroda ovog kraja predstavlja i ovaj spomenik, ovaj monument, nažalost devastiran, da podsjeti na vremena kada su ljudi bili ljudi i borili se protiv neljudi.